Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbiville. The early morning hours of June 6, 1944, the dawn of D-Day. Hours before sunrise and the beach invasion at Normandy came the paratrooper drop behind the beaches. Between them, the Americans and the British flew some 1,000 transport planes, and one of those was a C-47, piloted by Colonel Paul W. Stevens. Paul Stevens served his country as a flyer, and for more than 3 years of his long service, witnessed the war in Europe from his cockpit. His is a fascinating story. Please welcome to Veterans of the Valley, 90 years young, Paul W. Stevens, Texas A&M class of 1938. Paul, it's an honor to have you on Veterans of the Valley. September the 10th, 1916, you were born in Temple, 90 years ago plus now, and you came to Texas A&M in 1934. First thing I wanted to ask you is what was Texas A&M like in the mid-30s? What was the campus like? What was the atmosphere like here?
Well, it looked rather sparse and unkept, if you want to know. Like the drill field was kind of rough.
Right.
And it wasn't too impressive, in other words.
Right. Well, it was a military school full of guys.
That's right.
So I guess it didn't have to be too impressive.
All male, all in uniform.
You bet, and you were one of them. You graduated in 1938. You told me that you went to work for a steel fabricating company in Waco, and you were making a lot of steel that was going for military purposes. So you sort of
camps all over the country.
So you sort of realized what was coming just from what you were doing in work. Sort of talk about that and what that caused you to go ahead and do.
Well, as you say, it was pretty plain we were headed for war. So I was married and had a young daughter, and working in Waco, and I decided that, well, it'd make good sense if I go ahead and volunteer a 1-year active duty that FDR had offered,
right?
Which I did, and my wife wasn't too pleased with it, but it worked out better than we thought, because I went up to Wichita Falls, Texas, where a new air base was being built, and participated in that from the military side, accepting buildings. In fact, I'd inspect a new dormitory, and I'd walk out the door and after the inspection, and the troops would be lined up out in front to march in every time the dorm was finished. But it was an active time, actually, but I was also working with a bunch of former Army Air Corps check pilots or test pilots, teaching training in San Antonio, flying training. And they ribbed me till I finally agreed to apply for flight training, which didn't take long to come back. And so my wife and I experienced some strange things then by having to move quite often. So we rigged our automobile to carry a baby bed on top in a knockdown, of course, in a box, and pile all our belongings that we would need and move from base to base during basic training, primary training, and advanced training,
right.
3 different places, all out in the California, Arizona area.
Right.
Having completed that successfully, and having been going through in the grade, started out as a first lieutenant, but a promotion to a captain came through while I was in primary training.
Yes, sir.
From the previous job I'd had in Wichita Falls. Which made my life much easier. I did not have to take the military training that the cadets had to take. All I had to do was be there to fly for half a day every day.
Right. You were a captain, but you were being instructed by some second lieutenants,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely, because they knew how to fly and I didn't.
So you paid attention to them.
It come very naturally, really. It's just one of those things, I guess, that happened.
Right. First plane you flew, I think, in basic training was a single-engine biplane, which we have a photo of later on that we're going to talk about that.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, right. You came back to Texas for active duty. You thought you were going to be sent somewhere else, but turns out you stayed right here at home.
Come right back to Austin and found that the base wasn't ready for us there.
Yeah, at Bergstrom.
At Bergstrom. And so we moved up to a place in Missouri. and did our final checkout in the C-47 airplane.
C-47, it was made by Douglas. This was your airplane. This is what
Yes.
you flew during the war as a transport pilot. Talk a little bit more about that plane. It's fascinating. It was originally built as a commercial
It was a
airline.
passenger airplane, small door, and for paratroopers we had to have a larger door on it so they could jump clean. Had to have a heavier floor in the end of the airplane, strength-wise, to take the load that the paratroopers wanted with them. And this all ended up because they have to have larger engines on it than the commercial airline. And there were some undoubtedly other changes, but those were the major ones. And it was a nice airplane to fly. It
Right.
really was. It wasn't fast. We couldn't cross the country in one hop. You have to stop and lay over. But we did a lot of that. But we were putting together a group of C-47s, a group meaning 4 squadrons and a headquarters for the group. And they selected a place for that over in North Carolina, right on the South Carolina border and near the Atlantic Ocean.
Yes, sir.
And so our training into that airplane allowed us to fly out over the ocean and look for submarines, German submarines, while we were flying the airplane, learning to fly.
I see.
So that was interesting, but never saw one.
No.
And,
Good.
Having got that over with, we began to fill up the group, and I was in the 4th Squadron. I'm sorry, the 47th Squadron.
Yes, sir.
Of this group. I was the operations officer. And all the key people were former airline pilots who had been called to duty and accepted us work. And, but all the rest of us were pretty young, actually, compared to the airline pilots. And I appreciate that, too.
Indeed.
So after finishing that training and having the group pretty well assembled, we were ready to do whatever we were supposed to do. So they wanted us to go over to Africa as Rommel was being pushed out of the north coast of Africa.
Right.
So our airplane wouldn't fly across the Atlantic direct, of course. We had to go down through the islands of the
Caribbean.
South and the Caribbean, and then into Brazil, stopping along at such places as the mouth of the river, Big River, and then one leg over to the nearest point in Africa, to the nearest point in Brazil, to Africa. From there, we could fly to an island out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean called Ascension Island. It's just a big rock, but the engineers had knocked places for us to park the airplanes around and had a little runway on it. That was more uphill than it was level by far.
Yes, sir.
But that was a rest stop. And from there went on into Africa, out around plantations. And from there went up to Morocco and moved over to a place called Oujda, which was a little more to the east. And there we waited for Rommel to be cleared out completely all the way to Cairo, which occurred rather rapidly. And then we moved our squadron up to a wheat field in Tunisia.
Right.
And preparing for dropping paratroopers in Sicily.
Indeed. The invasion of Sicily was, I guess, really the first campaign that you were directly
That was the
involved in.
first troop carrier drop of major size.
Right.
And it was very interesting because we did it at night. And you're flying at night in formations that is scary in itself. But approaching Sicily, all of a sudden just a wall of fire appeared climbing into the sky as the enemy on the ground was firing away. But we were somewhat distant away when that happened.
Indeed.
But as we approached, that firing began to die down. And what was happening is our fighter pilots were strafing all these gun emplacements on the ground. By the time we got there, with very little, relatively speaking, So we made our drop rather easily, and but some of the bunch that was dropping did get shot up some.
Right, right. You talked about the second drop. The first
Yeah,
drop
then-
went pretty
Then
smoothly.
the second drop came.
The second drop.
This, I didn't go on that one because on the first drop, my squadron commander broke down because he lost a pilot. That was a close friend of his. And so he had to be relieved, and so I was made the squadron commander at that time. So the boss told me to stay and let the rest of the guys go.
Right.
So, but they run into some trouble, some squadrons more than others, because they were flying over, the merchant marines were unloading freight on the beaches where we had to cross over into Sicily. And they had just been strafed and bombed by the Germans, and they were very trigger happy.
Right.
And so they shot down Americans just the same as the Germans.
Yeah, it was a friendly fire situation.
Friendly
It turned
fire,
out
that's correct.
quite tragic. You spent, I want to move on, but I know that you spent a lot of that time after that moving troops back and forth from the
Yep.
East Coast to the West Coast
That's
of
correct.
Africa, from
That's right.
Casablanca to Cairo.
I set up an airline back at Tunis, and I flew them from Casablanca to Cairo, and from Cairo back to Tunis. Anything that's going on in between there, we'd deliver passengers or whatever.
And you told me it was during your time there in Tunisia at Tunis that you got to witness one time from afar a little bit, but you were there when the big three arrived:
That is
Churchill, Roosevelt, and
correct.
Stalin.
We had our squadron, air echelon only. The ground people were back on Sicily, but we were holed up in the ammunition storage buildings.
Right.
And but anyway, I started out to get to one of my buildings and Lord, the MPs were all over the place, and they stopped me and wouldn't let me go out there. But I could stay where I was, and I could see the operations office building, I should say, further down the strip. And suddenly these bigger airplanes come landing in down there, and so I found out that it was a meeting of the big three taking place, and
Right.
Churchill and
And Roosevelt and Stalin.
Stalin
Right.
and Roosevelt are all there. Yeah.
Right. Well, that must have been a sight that you'll
was.
never forget.
There was quite a lot of going on.
I want to move on. We're going to have some photographs here in just a second, but then in the spring of that year, that's when you moved on to England to get ready for what would be the invasion of France and
It was
Normandy.
actually, yes, the spring of the next year.
Right. You were stationed in the Midlands. Sort of talk about what that was like and what that atmosphere was like.
Well, when we arrived in England, the base was built, but the buildings were Quonset huts. I don't know whether you know what a Quonset hut is.
Sure.
Yeah. And but it was prepared for us, and I was very fortunate, I guess, to find it. But of course, we moved right inside. We were no longer in tents.
Right.
And but our training was rather stiff, and that we had to do a lot of dropping of paratroopers to train the boys for the next big drop that we knew was coming. And of course, the British were bombing Germany at the night, and we had airplanes dragging right across the treetops, coming in and going out, across the airbase where they wanted to go. Whereas our bombers then were working from high altitude and daytime drops, daytime bombing.
Right. So you spent a lot of the rest of the winter and the spring working with the
That's correct.
paratroopers.
Working-
I think it's a good time to break and let's go to some photographs and sort of see what some of the things
All right,
that we've been
gosh.
talking about, and then we'll come back and talk about Normandy and the invasion and after that. So let's go ahead and go to some of the photographs that Colonel Stevens has provided for us. You can look right there and see. Now that's a young and a somewhat older Stevens. The one on the left is you as a Texas A&M student, right?
Yes, that's right. That's a uniform for a cadet at A&M.
So that would have been taken in about, I guess, your senior year, maybe
No,
1938?
I was taking that would be with a blue collar. That was the first year.
Oh, first year. So you were a fish.
Yeah.
So 1934.
Yeah.
There you go. And then we move on, I guess, closer to your retirement time, obviously on the right. And
Yes, that was pretty well downstream.
good-looking soldier in both pictures.
Well, okay.
Yes, sir.
I'll agree with you on that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Handsome soldier. Okay, let's move on. This is a Christmas card, but this is a picture of the biplane that where you first learned how to fly, right?
Yes, that's very much like the Stearman, two-place open cockpits, and it's, of course the color is there, but which we did not have on our airplane.
Right. Well, this is a Christmas card, so it's supposed to look
Those
pretty.
airplanes are that type of airplane is still used quite extensively in crop dusting.
Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, you see them all the time, especially around this area. You sure do, down south. And okay, let's move on to the next picture. That's a beautiful Christmas card, by the way. Here's the C-47, and I
Yes.
believe you are on the far left of this picture. Talk about what we're looking at.
Well, that's just some of the officers of the squadron. I could make out by a deputy next to me named, well,
And the rest of the group.
and the rest of them are officers that held various positions in the squadron.
Right.
We had to have a supply officer and a mess officer and all these sort of things.
Got another photograph, a little bit wider shot of this aircraft, and you can get an idea
Oh,
of the
that
wingspan.
gets a squadron in it now.
Yeah, that's the whole squadron, and
Yep.
and underneath the entire wingspan of the C-47.
Yeah, that's about 108 feet or something
108
like that.
feet from tip to tip. Quite an airplane. Quite an
It turned
airplane.
out to be a very substantial airplane. It would take a lot of beating.
Yep.
One time I saw one of them had come back from a drop where there's pretty fierce fighting, and you could theoretically drive a Jeep from wingtip to wingtip. There wasn't any cab there.
Oh, my
And
goodness.
the pilot's cockpit was up there, and the tail structure was up there, but there's nothing above the wing.
But it had been shot away in between.
Been shot away.
I'll be darned. Okay, let's move on. This is a fascinating picture. You described a moment ago sort of the formations.
Yes, the formation
three,
is,
Yeah, three plane formations in groups of 9,
that's correct.
and just one after another. Mm-hmm. And this is a photograph of a drop. You can see the
Yes,
paratroopers
that's-
coming.
I don't know whether that's already dropped or have a
Right.
late jumper, or was it an early jumper?
Right.
I would say it's a late jumper.
Exactly. I
But,
think we've got
For
another
the
picture.
big invasion,
Now this to me is just an
Yeah, that's-
incredible photograph.
yeah, you can see a paratrooper coming out there, I think.
You said that, yes, sir, right below the airplane. That's it. And
Yep.
they came out fast, about 2 per
He
second,
comes
right?
through that door, and the chute is automatically pulled for him.
Yeah,
A cable does that.
right.
And he swings once and comes back and touches the ground.
Because you said that this is only an altitude of about 900 feet,
900
right?
feet was
That's
what-
not very high.
No, some wanted us to go even lower,
Right.
and some did.
Right,
But that was hazardous. You drag somebody on that
right.
pretty easy.
And some of them, some who didn't know better wanted you to go slower. We'll talk about that
Oh,
in a little bit too. That's kind of a funny story. Let's move on
All
as
right.
we finish up the pictures. Talk about this. This is you, and you're receiving an award, and that's in France. Is that right?
Yes, that's the Frenchman awarding us each Croix de Guerre award. That's one of their rather general awards, I think. And you have the Red Star, the Gold Stars, and the Silver Croix de Guerres. They're all in various stages.
Right.
But anyway, we were all awarded a Croix de Guerre.
Uh-huh. Well, that's a
For the Frenchmen wanted to do something for the people who came in there and made the first
Right,
landing
right,
at
right.
the damn ship.
That's just a few of the photographs that we have time for. Let's talk about D-Day and Normandy and getting ready, because it's a fascinating story. June 6, 1944, and you were piloting the C-47 that had some paratroopers that you jumped out of your plane behind the beaches at Normandy.
Yeah.
Sort of talk about that day and what you remember of it.
Well, of course, we made our swing around, so we were coming back from the south to the north, you might say. And so we'd be south of Cherbourg. And, the first pass, the first night of it, we didn't get much trouble. There were some, I won't say some that got hit, say there was lots of trouble. But we didn't lose many airplanes that first time.
Right.
And but on the second run, the next night, early morning it would be, we had lots of ground fire on us. We were dropping supplies to the spots where we had dropped the paratroopers. And many airplanes were lost, and I was unfortunate enough to lose an engine on that. I found my oil pressure was going to zero suddenly, so that meant my engine was about to burn up, so I shut it down. But the propeller wouldn't stop turning. It was swinging in the wash, meaning I was pushing a whole barn door along with me. And we'd already had bundles drop from underneath it, and each one of those bundles had a windbreak on it, a drag brake about that big around, just a big concave plate to keep the bundles from getting knocked off by a slipstream. And that was real slow, really slowed us up. We'd stagger along about 90 miles an hour all the way across. And it was tough. But anyway, when I lost an engine, I wasn't going to fly back. It was gradually losing altitude. And my radar operator had taken a bullet through the leg, through his knee. And he was crippled up and knocked out with drugs right away, of course. And but I said, we're going to have to ditch. The airplane's not going to go back. So I went around the back of all the ships in there and looking for one with a red cross on it. While I was doing that and was getting lower and lower, I thought the waves underneath us are just rolling. We had a pretty big wind that night, as you know. And I said, well, that won't do it all, because if we hit that water with those bundle protectors underneath, it's going to nose us right to the bottom, and nobody will get out.
Yes, sir.
So I said, well, I could turn that engine on and burn it up and maybe stop that prop from turning. It wouldn't feather. It would only turn. So we agreed, and we started the engine up, and in a little bit the crew chief hollered we were on fire. Well, yes, we were on fire because I was burning the engine up.
Yes. Uh-huh.
But all of a sudden the airplane shuddered and the prop stopped. But it was still flat in the wind, but it wasn't turning.
Right.
So I shut the thing down and started gaining a little altitude. We get up to 900 feet or so. And I could see the English coast cliffs over there, so I just headed for them. And we got on over there and found the airport and landed on it.
Yeah, you landed. That's another kind of a humorous story, because you landed at this strip, and the commander, the British commander, wasn't real happy with
He didn't like it a bit. It was a fighter unit, and of course the fighter unit was up over the peninsula fighting. Mm-hmm. And he was screaming at me about why did I land on his airport. I told him, well, I couldn't go any further. I had to land. Well, go somewhere else. Why did you do this? So I got kind of angry with him, and
you set him straight. What did you tell him?
Hmm?
You set him straight. What did you tell him?
I set him straight by telling him, look, this airport belongs to me as much as you. The U.S. is paid for the airport. They're actually paying you and all your people. I said, now, I don't like that a bit for you to fuss at me about using it to save my skin.
So you not only told him
off, so I said, now I want you to take your administrative airplane and fly my crew up to my base. And he just come apart.
Yeah, but he eventually
But he did,
took you back
and
home.
flew us back to the air base. And the boy that was shot through the knee was picked up and taken off to a hospital, and I didn't see him again.
And you were late. They thought that you were gone. They thought
that
you were
dead. I was gone.
They'd even replaced you already.
They had already designated a new commander for the squadron.
Right, but you took that.
But we took care of that right quick.
Right. Later on, you would do more drops in the European theater over Holland in what is known as Operation Market Garden.
Yes.
And other drops also.
Yeah.
Right.
Market Garden was very easy for us. We didn't have any problem. We made our drop across a river that we wanted to get protect the bridge there. But the British didn't move up fast enough, and of course we all say, well, they stopped for tea, but
right.
They didn't move up, but I think the troops still saved the bridge until the British got there the next day.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. Operation Market Garden is is the campaign that there was a book and even a movie made called A Bridge Too Far. That's that was what that was about.
Yeah.
You had not fired a shot
Oh.
until you decided that in this war you were going to fire your gun. Talk about that.
So I took my .45 pistol out,
Yeah.
pulled the window back in the cockpit, stuck it out there, and as a flak tower, old German flak tower went by, I fired it at one time.
Because you wanted to say you'd fired a
I
shot
fired
in the war.
one shot in the war.
You fired one shot in the war. You spent just over 3 years in Europe during this campaign, and then you finally went home. You were in Iceland, I think you said, when you found out about the Japanese the bombing of
We
Hiroshima. And
trailing on each
otherwise
other
you
out
thought,
of Scotland to we
Right.
got up to Iceland, and the weather was bad from there to Labrador.
right,
And this C-47, we were bringing them back, C-47, and there's a long haul from Iceland to Labrador, and there's
Yes,
a
sir.
point of no return. And once you go there, you go on, or you don't come back.
right,
But we had to have good weather to do that, so we were hung there for about a week.
Yes,
A
sir.
bad spell, and both bombs went off in Japan while
right.
we were there.
So you knew then that the war was probably going to end,
Oh,
and you
yeah.
wouldn't have to go to the Far East and
That's
continue.
right. We were headed for we knew we were headed for the Far East.
Right. There's a lot more to the story. I know that you eventually got back to the United States. You went to New England. They took your plane away from you and made you come back home by train.
That's correct.
Yeah, was it? That's
And
a
as
heck
we,
of a deal.
we
You
were
flew it
sitting in
everywhere.
the straight chairs on that train all night long, getting out to St. Louis, we were all tired as we could be, just worn out.
Right. And that's when they finally got you a sleeper car when you got to St.
Well,
Louis.
when we saw the prisoners of war going by us in
the
Pullmans, this just tore us apart.
Colonel Stevens, we are out of time. There's so much more to your story, but thank you very much for your service and visiting with us.
It's been very interesting to me. And
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
We appreciate you. Some 20,000 Aggies served in World War II, most coming from the classes of 1938 to 1944. Paul W. Stevens is proud to be one of those who returned to A&M to live out his career and enjoy his retirement. We thank him for his service, as we thank all veterans. For Colonel Paul Stevens, I'm Tom Turbiville. Be sure and join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.